Awesome, awesome. So you will be very glad to stay, I hope, because one of my mentors said, never give a speech unless you're going to change the world, or at least one person's world. And so my objective is to make some of you at least more effective. So quick show of hands, how many of you here are thinking of starting a startup? They're not currently doing, but they're thinking about. Okay, awesome. And how many of you are currently doing a startup? Awesome. And how many of you are not sure why you're here? I'm kidding. I was kidding. Okay, so if you want to know the story of my startup, so exactly what we do, please Google me. There's lots of information available as to why and how we're innovating the world. The purpose of this talk tonight is to talk less about the businesses that I build, but about the metrics of, you know, what and how allows me to combine a whole bunch of different hats and not go insane. Oops, this is my sign that I should be speaking. Look at that, I'm totally on time. So take your game to the next level in 7 steps is the title of my talk. And so each one of those steps is really, really important. And people are like, well, that's a very simple one. I practice these religiously, and that's my secret to success. So people say, how does she manage to be, you know, a practicing physician, mother of 3, runs companies, volunteers in the community? Well, this is how, short version. So this is really an innovative approach, but I'm afraid you can't consider it's never been done before. That defines my career. So whenever somebody in healthcare or in any other community environment usually says it can't be done, but if it was to be done, it would make a huge impact, I usually say, sign me up, tell me more, because I'd like to give it a try. And so after several tries of doing the impossible and completing it, you get this confidence of like, I've been there before. And the more people tell you, no, it can't be done, the more you're like, oh, I'm on the right path. So first rule is what got you here won't get you there. So it doesn't matter how successful you were in your previous life. And so I've managed $100 million implementations of electronic medical records across 10,000 physicians. When I started doing a startup in 2011, I knew nothing. I would literally walk up to people and say, I do not speak startup. Can you please explain what do you mean by Ruby on Rails or UX design or cloud-based whatever? And so Carol Dweck, Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. If you have not read this book, you have to read the book. On the topic, on the cover page, it says that it will change how your relationships work, how your performance at work, how your life would run. And it's a tall promise to have on top of a cover of a book page, but it's true. She explains the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. A fixed mindset is comfortable in the comfort zone. It means you're really, really good at something and you keep doing it, but at some point you get bored and you don't stretch your skills. A growth mindset says that I can learn anything. So right now I'm learning data science using a cool new app called Pi, P-Y. It's a free app and it allows anybody to learn any coding language, including data science, Duolingo style, 5 minutes a day. And so how we can learn to fulfill one's life potential, please read this book. It's absolutely a must read and pass along to others. Tip number 2 is you need to define what success means to you. If you're not clear on that, it's one of those Alice conundrums of, where would you like to go, says the cat. And Alice says, I'm not entirely sure. Well, then it doesn't really matter which way you go. And so I, from the beginning, started out with a big vision of, I've done stuff in Canada, which has gotten noticed. The next thing I wanted to do was going to be global. It was going to fit 4 criteria. Good, because it solves something that needs to be solved that impacts real people. Great, so innovative and forward-thinking. Global, so not just North America, but beyond. And then giving. Giving because it's generous to one's community, to one's partners, to one's employees, to customers, and all the other components of my ecosystem. And if you look up My Best Helper and Careteam and all the other things that I've done since, that has been true. That's my guiding principle. That's success to me. You need to define what does success mean to you. Third most important element is align your focus. And so how many people have read Jim Collins' Good to Great? Awesome. Everybody else, that's my second and only other recommendation of a book that is an absolute must-read if anyone's serious about accomplishing anything in life. Everything he writes in that book is applicable to businesses, but he can totally extrapolate it to people. And so he wrote a very famous book called Built to Last and looked at businesses that was successful for a really long time. And somebody said, well, that was easy because they were successful. You analyzed what happened. That's kind of retrospective. Could you predict what would take a good business and make them go amazing? And he's like, well, that's a good question. He went back and did a whole bunch of analysis, and he found that there were 3 criteria that defined really successful companies. An absolute obsession over making sure all 3 of these are met in whatever you do. So number 1 is, how passionate are you about the space? I can talk to you guys about family and health all day long, all night long, all weekend long, anytime I'm sitting on the beach, and that's what I'm thinking of. Second is, you need to define what are you the most amazing at doing. So my part in that is I understand technology. That's not my kind of absolute super strength. So I surround myself with people who are really strong on the technology side. I surround myself with people who are really strong on the business side. But I know my customer, I know my problem, and I know the solutions that we need to build. And the third part is, what drives your economic engine? Do you want to build a non-for-profit? Do you want to build a for-profit? Do you want to build a mega corporation? Like, what is your magic number that defines success? And if those 3 are clear, you can communicate them to partners, to investors, to employees, to customers, and be really consistent and really successful. This one is one of mine. So I call that Go Picasso. Why Picasso? Yes, the painter. Both of these paintings were done by the same person, different stage. I knew Picasso in school as the man who created this. And then I discovered that he was actually, for about 12 years of his life, a most accomplished painter of these type of Mona Lisa-like portraits. And so it wasn't the question of putting a dot on the page and saying, I'm an artist. It was a question of learning the absolute best practices that everybody else had created, and then taking them a completely new level that only he could imagine. And so my code word for this on our team is, whatever you're gonna do, go find out what everybody in the world knows, whether it's Google or Facebook or Airbnb or whoever else is inventing it, and take it to the next level. Don't just copy what they're doing, but transcend that. So carpool analogy, principle number 5. Is something that was given to me by one of my mentors, Bill Thal, who was one of the people who wrote the Canada Health Act. One of 3 people who wrote that and convinced 10 provinces to sign it using this method. And he's built the Canadian Patient Safety Institute and a whole bunch of other alliances, and I've used it very successfully. And so anyone who's worked with me already knows the analogy, but I see a lot of new faces in the room, which is fantastic. So you're gonna get the benefit of a carpool method. So what is the carpool method? Before you get into a car, the success of the trip depends on 4 factors. One is, do you even have the same destination? So if I'm driving to Montreal and you want to get to Hope or Calgary, then jump in. If you're driving to Seattle, clearly not the right carpool for you. So once you decide on the destination, so in my case in the startup, the conversation I have with people has to do with the 4 Gs. If you're not interested in being a global company, let's just stop there. If you're not interested in being the kind of company that's good and does the right thing, let's just stop there. If you want to do more of the same of what everybody else has done and not stretch technologically, again, not the same destination. Second point, and a very important point, because most people then jump straight into how we're going to do the trip. The second point has to do with values. And values include things like, will I obey the law? Would I smoke in the car? How fast do I want to get there? Do we have agreement on how many hours I drive versus the other person drives? And so it's a very simple analogy, and you can use it with, I've used it with investors, partners, employees, customers, and it's kind of a very quick way of making sure that we're all on the same page. And so the values question, once you solve that and you say we have the same values and the same destination, the other 2 steps are usually fairly straightforward. So equity of contribution. I may be the big, magnificent Canadian Medical Association with 84,000 members, but when I was negotiating with the Dermatology Society, which has 300, you basically say is without the Dermatology Society, that project would fail. So let me pay for the project, but then you get equal voting rights. And so the equity of contribution means let's define what is fair effort. So I may be the one who has the gasoline, the car, the map, the know-how, and the driving skills, but I really need you on the trip because otherwise I'll fall asleep. And so, having that clarity over what is fair contribution, what is expected of each partner so that we can keep each other accountable, creates agreement towards the end on how should we split the profits of the trip. So equality of praise. Publicly, we stand up and say, we did the trip together, and otherwise you split it up according to whatever you had decided on step 3. Painted picture is another tool that I learned from a local entrepreneur called Cameron Herold. He's written a book called Double Double, but there's a great video talk that he gives about this concept. And it has to do with the sound of music. So a lot of people, my generation and older, will say, of course we've seen the sound of music. Show of hands here, who hasn't? Right, see? There are lots and lots of people who actually don't know what the sound of music is. And so painted picture, the easiest way to explain that is to say, if I had a really, really dedicated employee and I said, please organize a picnic for 7 children that is safe and memorable, where they have an activity and they eat some food. And the employee comes back and says, wow, this is an amazing trip. And I took them to Stanley Park, we went to the volleyball, and they had hot dogs and volleyball on the beach. And I yell at them because I had a vision of this. I had a vision of 7 kids playing music on somewhere near Whistler with picnic baskets. Whose fault is it? Is it the employee's fault for not being able to read my mind? Or for me not defining very clearly what the objective is? Or was that optional? And the most important thing in that task was for them to actually have a safe and memorable activity where they eat and do something together that was good for 7 kids. And so defining that up front is really, really important. And the last point, and I didn't realize that, this is one of my favorites, growth for adversity, is everyone who comes up to you and says you can't do it is actually helping you. Some people randomly will declare that you can't do it, those are useless, but anyone who actually has a specific reason why, sit them down and interview them, because everybody else who says, oh, yes, of course you will do, are not very helpful. But the ones who are like, these are all the reasons why your startup's gonna suffer, interview what they mean specifically by each one of those points, take notes, and grow through that. I was today at a session where Rick Hansen spoke, just like an hour ago, and talk about growing from adversity. If you have not seen his talk, you don't know his story, please watch it and then help his effort. But if he can do in a day where it's like -50 crossing the prairies in a chair, and his kind of mantra was one more stroke, then any one of us can also do that. And as an entrepreneur, it's really funny because it's equivalent to in the medical world is if any one of you came and said, I'm so excited I'm gonna be a new parent. My perspective on parenting is somewhat jaded because I know all the things that can go wrong. And I can give you a long list of all the things that are likely to go wrong, even if your kid ends up being okay. But why would I? Like, you were excited about being a parent and having a new baby. In the startup world, there seems to be no qualms about that. Anybody and their grandmother is happy to walk up to you and tell you exactly why you're gonna fail for all of the different reasons you're gonna fail. And so my kids call this the video game analogy to startups because initially they thought that, mom succeeded and she got an award. And I think with My Best Helper, we got 24 different awards in 4 years, including Google for Entrepreneurs and the Cartier Foundation, McKinsey and SIAD, Paris delivered, only Canadian team to win that. And they're like, mom's won something, now we can relax. And in fact, it's like a video game. The next level is harder, faster, there's more people shooting at you, so it never stops. But if you have a mindset of that's how it's supposed to be, that you're supposed to learn from adversity, then it gets easier. And I have a bonus point. This is my way of cheating to my 7 points, but it's very important. All of the things that I described before, kind of foundational concepts that we have written out, and they allow me to onboard people who really understand what we're trying to accomplish and reduce the day-to-day work of trying to communicate that to people. And it creates, it mobilizes an army of people who are my tribe, who are my supporters. They are people who are investors, advisors, employees, former employees, users who understand what we're trying to do, in spite of the overwhelming odds, and work with us. But unless you know what you're fighting for, at what point the success is kind of your personal success, but also your company success, Clarifying that up front is really, really important. So with Careteam, what we're fighting for is not just the absence of fragmentation of care or confusion or loneliness at the very moment when a loved one's diagnosed with cancer or dementia or some horrible other disease, but it's actually the presence of a happy moment in a moment of vulnerability. It's knowing that you'll be okay. It's knowing that there are people you can reach on into and be supported by. And so that is, it's not the absence of bad things, but it's the presence of good things that motivates us. And last but not least, Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. Listening to other people's inspiring stories and watching Nat and Jason and all the other ones kind of go from idea to reality, and nowadays it kind of looks easy retrospectively. It's always very inspiring. So kudos to all the entrepreneurs. Let's keep sharing our stories, and thank you for giving me this format.
So the floor is open for any questions, if you want to just come to the front. Okay, we have a really shy crowd today for some reason. I love the Picasso analogy. I just was at the museum in Paris and, oh, Kenny.
Fantastic talk, really, really liked it. I think for a lot of people it's really difficult to know what your values are and especially how to build them into a company. And I can tell you see the importance of values, and from my experience they're really important as well. So do you have any advice for people on how to unearth what the values really are and what they should be, so that way, and how to look for those values in other people so that way there's a value alignment in the company?
That's a great question. So I was the beneficiary of a lot of executive coaching in my previous roles, and so Harvard Business Coaches and whatnot. And so I didn't know how much more powerful I was going to be until people helped me clarify how these soft skills can make you go further and why you should do the work. And so step number one is get people to really understand that it makes no sense that it's an important thing to do, but it's a very important thing to do. And values have also to do with brand. And whether you want or not, you have a brand and might as well cultivate it. And so anyone who knows me would know that it's all about women, technology, family, healthcare, and giving back or paying it forward, right? Those are kind of core and foundational. It's taken me years to kind of decide what is nice but optional. Like if you rip it off from the list, I'm okay with that. But these things you rip off, it feels like you're ripping an arm off. We have 25 values in our heads. Typically, most of us identify 3 or 4, maybe 5. But making that full list and saying, like, same kind of analysis, if I was to take that word away, so like, you know, integrity or honesty and physicians, like if you take that word away, that is such a value that is inherently important, but it gets summed up under professionalism. So, you know, you personally choose or gravitate towards words, and over time they evolve. And so start with 3 or 4, and then grow from there. And then I read a really neat book that helped a lot, which was, if you had to pick a character out of a movie, and this is the reference to Jedi, and so it was a real, I loved Star Wars as a kid, and Star Trek, but more Star Wars than Star Trek. And so Jedis, you know, kind of fit. And so in the book, they basically said is pick any character of a book or movie or story, and decide that if that was you, as a representation of you or of your company, go through like 12 questions of what do you do when you're sad? What do you do when you're scared? What do you do when you're happy? Who are your friends? Who are your enemies? How do you behave? How do you treat people when you're under attack, right? And so kind of that helped really clarify a lot of the values about who you are, but it also helped companies. So my Best Helpers kind of avatar exists internally. We never talk about it publicly, but it helps explain to the team what kind of things we do and what kind of things we don't in a very simple format. Great question.
If you want to come to the front, I'm going to pass it to Rana right
now. Thank you for the talk. That was really great. This is a very general question, but what advice would you give someone looking to be in the medical tech field in kind of Vancouver or British Columbia for the time being, and then kind of going global?
So Any startup is hard. I would say healthcare and education are probably amongst the harder ones. At the last medical kind of innovation meeting called HIMSS, and there was a whole row called the future of faxes. And so if any of you think that faxes have a future, then it was pretty sad, but yes. So it's an industry that's managed to kind of insulate against change in many different ways. And so Canada is harder, unfortunately, than the US. It's easier for me to get a phone call returned by somebody I've never met at Hopkins or Harvard than it is to get phone calls back from people I know really well and have worked with in anywhere across Canada. And so everybody tells me that we shouldn't, but then I meet my colleagues who are oncologists and say, like, did we give up when cancer was incurable? And no, you try 1,000 ways and you make it succeed, because our patients deserve the courage that we need to have to face the system. But in the face of that many odds, connecting to others, so we have a health CEO circle, we have, connected to the US counterparts who are also who are struggling compared to fantasy football startups or something different that is less regulated, less entrenched, less complicated. You're welcome. There was a question here, I think, Greg?
Oh, thank you.
I found it interesting. You talked a little bit about how you, although you have your core values baked into your organization, you don't expound on that publicly. I've had experiences on both sides of the coin, and sometimes by stating your values publicly on your site and in your reporting to your core stakeholders, it holds you to a higher account, but it's not without its risks. Do you want to touch on that for a minute?
Well, I still see us as one of those kind of statues that you're putting together, but it's not entirely set. And so part of it is we're still experimenting and growing. And as a founder, I think a lot of people have like it's my company. I've never seen it as my company. I've seen it as our company. And so, as we evolve through users or whatnot, we're getting better. And so I think the time will come when we can stand up and say, this is what we really believe in. But until they're fully done, it feels too early. And so the constant experimentation is fun, and trying to articulate something that's uniquely ours. And so big iconic companies like Netflix and others took time to evolve with their values, and I think that that's the process we're following.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
So first off, I think you said that you were negotiating the amount of praise that the stakeholders would get, and if you could clarify that, that would be great. And the second question was, how do you reward the contribution of the person who sits in the car beside you and keeps you awake? Do you give them equity, or do you give them some other way to recognize their contribution?
That's great. And so the answer to that is you need to have clarity on that answer before you start the trip, because worst case scenario is you arrive at destination and you start squabbling. And so by making that clear up front, it's very helpful. There are situations in which I've been very instrumental in making something happen, but for a whole bunch of reasons, I didn't want to be part of the public experience behind it. And so one of my favorite sayings, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit. And so in that case, part of my negotiation was to not be part of the public, and not have shares, because then I'd have to declare them. I was chair of school board, and so it was too complicated on my end. But having that clarity up front, in the case of the Canadian Medical Association of Dermatology Society that I mentioned, we decided that the praise was going to be equal. Even though the majority of the funding came from one source, they were almost like the little spice or the thing that actually made the whole thing work, and therefore they deserved equal praise. And so that's what we shared in public. And so having that decision up front and then written up so that people don't forget or change their minds is really, really important. And you can always renegotiate. Like if you're halfway down the trip and you realize something's changed. But a lot of people don't spend time. The 2 big failures of this model is values and then the praise. People go from, are you heading in my direction, jump in, and this is how we split the cost of the gas, but that's not the whole story. I think there was a hand up there or something.
This is the last
Oh, last question, great.
I was just really curious how you came to the distinction between trying to introduce the positive versus getting rid of the negative, because I thought that was a really beautiful way to articulate your mission. And I was curious if that was something you saw right from the beginning or if that evolved, that distinction.
Sorry, which part of the mission?
Just that you mentioned that you guys were fighting to bring a smile to people in a time of vulnerability rather than reducing all of the bad things.
Well, I think, so one is there's a huge temptation when you're doing startups is to fix what is instead of imagining what is going to be. And so like our foundational belief with Careteam is that hospitals are an invention of the 20th century, and then very, very soon we're going to have tricorder devices and wearables at home that are going to manage most of our healthcare issues. And so instead of trying to optimize how the hospital works, we're trying to imagine the operating system of the hospital of the next century. And so that is a very different way of thinking, and so we have to do some things that make sense today, but our eyes firmly on the future. And then too many people solve and kind of reduce the problem and just stop there. And so to us, that's not success. To us is you actually need, when I'm in my clinic, if I deliver perfectly correct robot-like performance, or I give you a diagnosis and all that, that's not the humane way of treating people. And so one of our early values that I suppose will probably survive is we want to build something that's built for humans and for healthcare. So it has all of the professionalism requirements, privacy and security, but also brings that fun human element of recognizing that sometimes until you get a diagnosis, several weeks spent with anxiety, but that experience does not have to necessarily be negative the whole time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A round of applause. Thank you.